the most important place in George Strait's life, and it's not a stage. The reason why George Strait rarely gives interviews. The Texas sun blazed mercilessly overhead as George Strait stepped out of his dusty pickup truck, his weathered boots hitting the cracked earth of what had once been his childhood paradise. The legendary country music icon, known to millions as the King of Country, stood motionless for a long moment, his steel blue eyes surveying the deteriorating landscape before him. Broken fence posts leaned at odd angles like old cowboys nursing their wounds, and the barn that had once housed his father's prize horses now sagged under the weight of decades and neglect. This wasn't just any piece of Texas real estate. This was sacred ground, the place where young George Harvey Strait had learned to ride, to rope, and to dream of stages far beyond the rolling hills of Pearsall. The place where his father, John Byron Strait, had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his bank account, but by the strength of his character and his respect for the land that sustained him. George removed his signature black cowboy hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair, feeling every one of his 70 years settling into his bones like dust after a long drought. He had sold over 100 million records, performed for crowds that stretched beyond the horizon, and earned more money than 3 generations of his family could spend. Yet standing here, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, he felt as hollow as an abandoned well. The decision to come here hadn't been planned. Just 3 days ago, he had been sitting in his sprawling San Antonio mansion, staring at a real estate listing that his assistant had casually mentioned. "Thought you might find this interesting, George," she had said, sliding the paper across his mahogany desk. "The old Strait family farm is back on the market. If you're enjoying this story and feeling the pull of these Texas roots just like George's, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from and what memories of home this story is bringing up for you. Your support means everything to us as we continue sharing these powerful stories of heart and heritage. The words had hit him like a physical blow. The farm had been sold when his father passed away in 1989, during the height of George's career, when he was too busy touring and recording to fight for what should have been his birthright. It was a decision that had haunted him for over 3 decades, a regret that fame and fortune could never quite silence. Now, as he walked slowly toward the house where he had spent the first 18 years of his life, every step stirred up memories as thick as the dust beneath his feet. There was the oak tree where he had carved his initials alongside those of his high school sweetheart. There was the porch where his mother used to shell peas while humming old hymns. And there, barely visible through the overgrown pasture grass, were the remnants of the corral where he had spent countless hours with Whisper. Whisper. The name alone was enough to make George's throat tighten with emotion. The small quarter horse had been more than just an animal to the young George Strait. Whisper had been his confidant, his companion, and his connection to a world that valued substance over style. Together, they had explored every acre of the family's modest spread, from the creek that ran crystal clear after spring rains to the mesquite groves where cattle sought shade during the brutal summer months. His father had bought Whisper as a colt, and George had been there for every milestone in the horse's life. He remembered the first time Whisper had accepted a saddle, the first time he had trusted George enough to let him mount, and the countless rides they had taken across the Texas countryside as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "That horse has got your number, boy," his father used to say with a laugh. "He knows you better than you know yourself." John Byron Strait had been a man of few words but deep wisdom, a rancher who understood that the bond between a cowboy and his horse was sacred, something that couldn't be bought, sold, or traded. He had taught George that respect was earned, not demanded, and that a true cowboy never forgot where he came from, no matter how far his trail might lead. As George approached the front door of the farmhouse, he noticed that the paint was peeling and several of the porch boards had rotted through. The screen door, hung askew on its hinges, and weeds had grown up through the cracks in the foundation. It broke his heart to see his childhood home in such disrepair, but what truly devastated him was the realization that he had allowed this to happen. He had been so focused on conquering Nashville, on proving that a cowboy from South Texas could make it in the big leagues, that he had forgotten the very lessons his father had tried to teach him. Success without roots was just another form of poverty, and all the platinum records in the world couldn't replace the peace he had once found in this simple place. A sound from behind the house caught his attention, and George turned to see an elderly man emerging from what remained of the barn. The stranger was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent working under the Texas sun. His clothes were simple but clean, and his movements carried the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the tasks that truly mattered. "You must be George Strait," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Raymond Torres. I've been taking care of this place for the past 15 years. George shook the offered hand, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. "I appreciate what you've done here, Raymond. I know it hasn't been easy." "Yours." Raymond's dark eyes studied George's face with an intensity that was both respectful and appraising. "Your daddy was a good man," he said simply. "He taught me more about horses in 5 years than I learned in the previous 20. Always said his boy would come back someday." The words hit George like a punch to the gut. His father had believed he would return, even when George himself had given up on that possibility. "I should have come back sooner," George admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe," Raymond replied with a slight shrug. "But maybe you came back exactly when you were supposed to." There was something in the older man's tone that suggested he knew more than he was saying, and George found himself studying Raymond's face for clues. Before he could ask what that meant, Raymond began walking toward the back of the property, motioning for George to follow. They walked in comfortable silence past the remains of the chicken coop where George's mother had raised prize-winning Rhode Island Reds, past the garden plot where she had grown tomatoes and corn, and past the old windmill that had pumped water for the livestock. Each landmark triggered a flood of memories, some sweet and some bittersweet, all of them precious in their own way. As they crested a small hill that George remembered climbing as a boy, Raymond stopped and pointed toward a small pasture that was separated from the main property by a new fence. "There's something I think you need to see," he said quietly. George looked in the direction Raymond was pointing and felt his heart skip a beat. Standing in the center of the pasture was a horse that looked remarkably similar to Whisper. The same compact build, the same distinctive coloring, the same proud carriage that had made Whisper stand out among all the other horses on the ranch. "That's not possible," George breathed, his legs suddenly feeling weak. "His name is Thunder," Raymond explained. "He's Whisper's great-great-grandson. The bloodline never left this place, just like your father wanted." George gripped the fence rail for support as the full implications of Raymond's words sank in. For over 30 years, while he had been traveling the world and building his career, a living piece of his past had been thriving right here on the land he had abandoned. Thunder lifted his head at the sound of their voices and trotted over to the fence, his dark eyes intelligent and curious. When the horse pressed his muzzle against George's outstretched palm, the country music legend felt tears streaming down his cheeks for the first time since his father's funeral. Thunder's touch was gentle but insistent, as if he somehow understood the significance of this moment. "Your daddy made me promise," Raymond continued softly. "Said that no matter what happened to this place, Whisper's bloodline would stay here until you came home. I've kept that promise for 15 years, even when times got hard and buyers came sniffing around." George couldn't speak. The emotion was too overwhelming, the connections too profound. Here was proof that his father's love had transcended death itself, that the bonds forged in this place were stronger than time, distance, or regret. Thunder nickered softly and nudged George's shoulder, just as Whisper used to do when he sensed his young rider was troubled. But even as George marveled at this miraculous reunion, Raymond's expression grew troubled. "There's something else you need to know," the older man said reluctantly. "This place is set to be sold next week. The new buyers want to tear everything down and build condominiums. They've already put a deposit down, and the papers are supposed to be signed on Friday." The news hit George like a physical blow. He had found his way back to his roots, discovered that his father's final gift had been waiting for him all these years, only to learn that it was all about to be destroyed. The irony was cruel and sharp, like a knife twist in an old wound. "Who are the buyers?" George asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Some development company out of Dallas," Raymond replied. "They came through here last month with their fancy suits and clipboards, talking about maximizing the property's potential and bringing progress to rural Texas. They don't understand what this place really is." George looked out over the land that had shaped him, at Thunder, who represented an unbroken chain of heritage and tradition, and felt a fire ignite in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about nostalgia or sentimentality. This was about preserving something authentic in a world that seemed increasingly artificial, about honoring the sacrifices of the generations who had come before. As the sun began to set behind the mesquite trees, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors George remembered from his youth, he made a decision that would change everything. Thunder stood quietly at the fence, as if sensing that his destiny and that of the land he called home hung in the balance. The king of country had returned to his kingdom, but the battle for its survival was just beginning. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only Texas could deliver, the air so clean it seemed to wash the soul with each breath. George had spent the night in the old bunkhouse behind the main property, a structure that Raymond had kept in better condition than the main house. Sleep had been elusive, filled with dreams of his father's voice and the sound of Whisper's hooves on hard-packed earth. Raymond was already up when George emerged, tending to Thunder with the kind of careful attention that spoke of deep affection. The older man moved with practiced efficiency, checking the horse's legs, examining his hooves, and running gentle hands along his neck and shoulders. It was clear that Thunder wasn't just livestock to Raymond, he was family. "How long have you been taking care of him?" George asked, accepting the cup of strong black coffee that Raymond offered. "Since he was foaled 8 years ago," Raymond replied, his weathered face softening as he looked at the horse. "His mama died giving birth, and I had to bottle feed him every few hours for months. Your daddy always said that the horses you raise by hand develop the deepest bond with their people." George nodded, remembering countless mornings when his father had made similar observations while they worked together in these same fields. John Byron Strait had possessed an almost mystical understanding of horses, an ability to read their moods and respond to their needs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere experience. "Tell me about the buyers," George said, settling onto an upturned feed bucket that served as an impromptu chair. "What exactly do they have planned for this place?" Raymond's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Luxury condominiums, they call it. Phase 1 of something called Heritage Hills, 300 units, each one selling for more than most folks around here make in 5 years. They showed me the plans last month when they came to do their final inspection." The irony of the name wasn't lost on George. Heritage Hills. They were planning to destroy actual heritage to build fake heritage, replacing authentic Texas history with mass-produced nostalgia, designed to appeal to wealthy city dwellers who wanted to play cowboy on the weekends. "Who's the developer?" George pressed. "Consolidated Development Corporation out of Dallas, run by a man named Marcus Whitfield. Real smooth talker, expensive suit, the kind of handshake that feels like he's trying to sell you something even when he's just saying hello." Raymond spat into the dust, his distaste evident. He kept talking about bringing economic opportunity to rural communities and modernizing the Texas landscape, made my skin crawl. George had encountered men like Whitfield throughout his career, Executives who saw dollar signs where others saw soul, who could reduce the most meaningful experiences to profit margins and market demographics. They were the same kind of people who had tried to convince him to abandon his traditional country sound in favor of whatever was trending on the pop charts. "What about the current owner?" George asked. "Why are they selling?" Raymond's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since George had met him, the older man looked every one of his 60-plus years. "That would be Clara Martinez. She inherited the place from her uncle about 20 years ago. Good woman, runs a small veterinary practice in town, but she's been struggling ever since her husband died in that oil rig accident 3 years back. Medical bills, funeral expenses, trying to raise 2 teenagers on her own. The drought last summer didn't help either." George felt a pang of sympathy for a woman he had never met. Clara Martinez was facing the same impossible choice that had forced countless rural families to abandon their heritage in recent decades. Hold on to the land and risk financial ruin, or sell to developers and watch everything their ancestors had built disappear under concrete and asphalt. "She doesn't want to sell," Raymond continued. "Told me so herself just last week. But she doesn't see any other option. The development company offered her twice what the land is worth agriculturally, and she needs the money to send her kids to college." As they talked, Thunder had wandered closer to the fence, as if drawn by the sound of their conversation. George stood and walked over to the horse, marveling again at the resemblance to Whisper. But it wasn't just the physical similarities that took his breath away. There was something in Thunder's eyes, an intelligence and sensitivity that seemed to bridge the decades between past and present. "Your father used to say that horses remember things differently than people do," Raymond observed, joining George at the fence. "Said they remember feelings and connections more than specific events. Maybe that's why Thunder took to you so quickly yesterday." George extended his hand again, and Thunder immediately pressed his muzzle against his palm, the greeting as natural as if they had been companions for years, rather than strangers meeting across the span of generations. The horse's breath was warm against George's skin, and he could feel the steady rhythm of Thunder's heartbeat through the contact. "I have something else to show you," Raymond said after a few minutes. "Something I've been saving until I was sure you were really ready to see it." They walked back toward the main house, but instead of going inside, Raymond led George around to a small storage shed that had once served as his father's workshop. The building was in better condition than most of the other structures on the property, its tin roof recently repaired and its windows still intact. Raymond produced an old-fashioned key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. Inside, the shed was surprisingly well organized, with tools hanging neatly on the walls and several wooden crates stacked in precise rows along one side. But what caught George's attention immediately was a large trunk sitting in the center of the space, its leather surface worn smooth by decades of handling. "Your father left specific instructions," Raymond explained. "Said this trunk was to be given to you when you came home, not before. I've been keeping it safe all these years, waiting for this day." George approached the trunk with reverence, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were treasures from his childhood that he thought had been lost forever. His first saddle, the one his father had custom-made for his 12th birthday, his collection of belt buckles from junior rodeo competitions, photos of him and Whisper that he hadn't seen in decades. But beneath these physical mementos lay something even more precious, a leather-bound journal filled with his father's careful handwriting. George lifted the book with shaking hands, and Raymond quietly excused himself, sensing that this moment required privacy. The first entry was dated just 2 months after George had left for Nashville to pursue his music career. His father's words were measured and thoughtful, reflecting on his son's departure with a mixture of pride and melancholy that brought tears to George's eyes. "George left today for Tennessee," the entry began. "I can't say I'm not worried about him trying to make it in the music business, but I've never seen him more determined about anything. He's got his mama's voice and his grandpa's stubborn streak, so maybe he'll surprise us all. I just hope he remembers that success isn't measured only in dollars and applause." George turned the page and found another entry. This one focused on Whisper and the horse's reaction to his absence. His father had noticed that Whisper would stand at the gate every evening around sunset, looking toward the road as if expecting George to come riding up the drive. The image was so vivid and heartbreaking that George had to pause in his reading to collect himself. As he continued through the journal, George discovered that his father had documented not just the daily operations of the ranch, but his hopes and dreams for the future. There were detailed plans for expanding the horse breeding program, ideas for sustainable farming practices that would preserve the land for future generations, and most importantly, expressions of faith that his son would eventually return to claim his inheritance. One entry, dated just 6 months before his father's death, particularly struck George with its prophetic clarity. "I may not live to see it, but I know George will come back someday. This land is in his blood, just like music is in his soul. When he does return, he'll understand that the two aren't separate things. They're both expressions of the same truth, the same connection to something larger than ourselves." George closed the journal and sat in the dusty silence of the workshop, overwhelmed by the depth of his father's understanding and forgiveness. Even as George had built his career hundreds of miles away, his father had continued to believe in an eventual reunion, had continued to prepare for a homecoming that he might not live to witness. A sound from outside broke through his reverie, and George looked through the workshop window to see a black luxury sedan pulling up the drive. 3 men in expensive suits emerged from the vehicle, their movements crisp and businesslike. Even from a distance, George could tell they weren't locals. Their shoes were too shiny, their clothes too pressed, their bearing too urban for rural Texas. Raymond appeared from around the side of the house, his posture immediately becoming defensive as the men approached. George couldn't hear the conversation from inside the workshop, but he could see Raymond shaking his head and gesturing toward the main road, clearly trying to convince the visitors to leave. The largest of the 3 men, a silver-haired individual who carried himself with obvious authority, was becoming increasingly animated in his gestures. George watched as the man pulled out what appeared to be a legal document and began waving it in Raymond's face, his voice rising to a volume that carried across the property, even if the specific words remained unclear. Thunder, who had been grazing peacefully in his pasture, lifted his head at the commotion and began moving restlessly along the fence line. Horses were sensitive to tension and conflict, and George could see that Thunder was becoming agitated by whatever was happening between Raymond and the strangers. Finally, George could stand it no longer. He carefully placed his father's journal back in the trunk, closed the lid, and stepped out into the bright Texas sunlight. As he approached the group of men, he could hear fragments of their conversation, and what he heard made his blood pressure spike. "Final inspection. Contracts will be signed tomorrow. Bulldozers scheduled for Monday morning." The silver-haired man was clearly Marcus Whitfield, the developer Raymond had described. He was everything George had expected and worse, radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from wielding power without accountability. When Whitfield noticed George approaching, his expression shifted to one of polite but dismissive interest. "I'm sorry, but this is a private property matter," Whitfield said smoothly. "If you're looking for directions or something, I'm sure this gentleman can help you after we finish our business." Raymond's eyes met George's over Whitfield's shoulder, and the older man's expression was a mixture of apology and helplessness. It was clear that the developers were trying to pressure him into something he wasn't comfortable with, but also that he felt powerless to resist their legal and financial leverage. George took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his father's journal still fresh in his memory. The presence of Thunder just beyond the fence, and the legacy of this place settling into his bones like gravity itself. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades commanding the attention of stadium-sized crowds. "Actually, gentlemen," George said calmly, "I think this property matter might concern me more than you realize." The moment of recognition, when Marcus Whitfield realized exactly who he was talking to, would be the first crack in what had seemed like an inevitable chain of events. But George had no way of knowing that this confrontation would set off a series of discoveries that would shake everything he thought he understood about his father's final years and the true reason why Whitfield was so determined to acquire this specific piece of Texas land. The silence that followed George's words stretched like a taut wire across the dusty yard. Marcus Whitfield's confident smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself, but George caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed the developer's features. Recognition was dawning slowly, like sunrise over the Texas hill country. "George Strait," Whitfield said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and calculation. "The George Strait. Well, this is unexpected." He extended his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to turning every encounter into a potential business opportunity. "Marcus Whitfield, Consolidated Development Corporation. I have to say I'm a huge fan of your music." George shook the offered hand briefly, noting the soft palm and perfectly manicured nails that spoke of a life spent in climate-controlled boardrooms rather than under the Texas sun. "Mr. Whitfield, Raymond tells me you're planning to turn this place into condominiums." "Heritage Hills," Whitfield corrected smoothly, his marketing instincts kicking in automatically. "A luxury residential community that celebrates the authentic spirit of rural Texas while providing modern amenities and conveniences. We're very excited about the project." The irony of discussing authentic Texas spirit with a man who clearly wouldn't know genuine heritage if it kicked him in his expensive suit wasn't lost on George. Behind Whitfield, his two associates stood silently, their expressions unreadable behind designer sunglasses that probably cost more than most ranch hands made in a month. "And this has to happen right here?" George asked, gesturing toward the land that stretched out around them. "There's plenty of empty acreage in Texas, Mr. Whitfield. Why this particular piece?" Something shifted in Whitfield's demeanor, a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested George had touched on a sensitive subject. "Well, this property has several unique features that make it ideal for our vision. The location, the topography, the historical significance." Raymond stepped closer to George, his weathered face creased with concern. "They've been asking a lot of questions about the land's history," he said quietly. "Wanted to know about mineral rights, water rights, anything your father might have documented about the property over the years." George felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Mineral rights. In Texas, that could mean oil, natural gas, or any number of valuable resources that lay beneath the surface. His father had always been secretive about such matters, believing that a man's business was his own unless he chose to share it. "I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone," Whitfield continued, his tone becoming more persuasive. "In fact, Mr. Strait, having your name associated with Heritage Hills could be a tremendous marketing advantage. We'd be honored to discuss a partnership arrangement." Before George could respond, a rumble of thunder rolled across the landscape from the northwest. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, the kind of towering thunderheads that promised either salvation or destruction, depending on your perspective. In drought-stricken Texas, rain was always welcome, but storms could be violent and unpredictable. "Looks like weather coming in," Raymond observed, studying the approaching clouds with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his entire life reading the sky. "Could be a big one, judging by the way thunder's acting." George looked toward the pasture and saw that the horse was indeed showing signs of agitation, pacing along the fence line with his ears pinned back and his nostrils flaring. Horses often sensed changes in atmospheric pressure long before humans noticed them, and Thunder's behavior suggested that a significant storm was approaching. "We should probably continue this conversation another time." Whitfield said, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "The contracts are scheduled to be signed tomorrow afternoon anyway. Perhaps we could meet in town, somewhere more comfortable." But George wasn't ready to let the developer escape so easily. "Actually, Mr. Whitfield, I'd like to understand exactly what you're planning to do with this land. Raymond, could you show these gentlemen around while I check on Thunder? I want to make sure he's secure before the storm hits." It was a tactical move, designed to give George time to think and observe while keeping the developers occupied. Raymond understood immediately and nodded, leading Whitfield and his associates toward the main house, while George headed for Thunder's pasture. The horse came to him immediately, pressing his head against George's chest with an urgency that went beyond simple affection. Thunder was genuinely frightened, not just of the approaching storm, but of something else that George couldn't identify. The horse's breathing was rapid and shallow, and his muscles trembled beneath his coat. "Easy, boy," George murmured, running his hands along Thunder's neck in long, soothing strokes. "Well, what's got you so spooked?" As if in answer to his question, a sharp crack of lightning illuminated the darkening landscape, followed almost immediately by a boom of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The storm was moving faster than anyone had anticipated, and George could see sheets of rain already falling from the clouds like grey curtains being drawn across the horizon. He led Thunder toward a small shelter at the far end of the pasture, a three-sided structure that his father had built decades ago to provide protection for horses during severe weather. As they walked, George found himself thinking about the journal entries he had read that morning, particularly his father's observations about Thunder's bloodline and the special qualities that seemed to run in Whisper's descendants. "Your great-great-grandfather was brave in storms," George told the horse as they reached the shelter, "but he was smart enough to know when to seek protection too." Thunder settled somewhat once he was under cover, but he remained alert and restless, his dark eyes constantly scanning the approaching storm. George stayed with him, partly to provide comfort, but mostly because he wanted time to process everything that had happened in the past 2 days. The developer's interest in mineral rights was troubling, but it also suggested that there might be more to his father's property than George had realized. John Byron Strait had been a careful man, methodical in his record-keeping and thorough in his research. If there were valuable resources on this land, his father would have known about them. The first drops of rain began to fall as George made his way back toward the main house, where he could see Whitfield and his associates huddled on the covered porch with Raymond. The developer was gesticulating animatedly, clearly trying to make some kind of point, while Raymond stood with his arms crossed and his expressions skeptical. But as George approached, he realized that the conversation had taken a turn that none of them had expected. One of Whitfield's associates was holding what appeared to be an old survey map, and all three men were studying it intently while pointing toward various sections of the property. "This is definitely it," the associate was saying as George came within earshot. "The geological survey from 1973 confirms significant limestone deposits throughout this area. If the aquifer maps are accurate, we're talking about one of the largest underground water sources in South Texas. Water rights. In an increasingly drought-stricken region, access to reliable water sources was becoming more valuable than gold." Suddenly, Whitfield's determination to acquire this specific piece of land made perfect sense, and it had nothing to do with luxury condominiums or authentic Texas heritage. The rain began to fall harder, forcing all 5 men to retreat to the covered porch of the farmhouse. George found himself in the surreal situation of sharing shelter with men who were planning to destroy everything his father had worked to preserve, while outside, nature itself seemed to be protesting their presence with increasing violence. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and the thunder that followed was deafening. Raymond hurried to close the wooden shutters that protected the porch from driving rain, leaving them all in a dim, intimate space that felt more like a standoff than a casual conversation. "Seems like Mother Nature has her own opinion about your development plans," George observed, his voice carrying just enough edge to let Whitfield know that he had overheard the conversation about water rights. Whitfield had the grace to look embarrassed, but he recovered quickly. "Mr. Strait, I think there may have been some miscommunication about our intentions. Heritage Hills is absolutely a residential development, but we're also committed to responsible resource management. The water rights are just one aspect of ensuring the long-term sustainability of the community." "By community, you mean the 300 luxury condos you're planning to build?" George asked. "Among other amenities, yes," Whitfield confirmed. "But we're also planning a golf course, a spa facility, and a cultural center that would celebrate the musical heritage of Texas. In fact, we'd love to discuss naming the cultural center after you." The offer hung in the air like the ozone smell that preceded lightning strikes. George could see that Whitfield believed he had found the perfect leverage, the one thing that might convince the king of country to support the destruction of his childhood home. A cultural center bearing his name would be a kind of immortality, a legacy that would outlast his records and his concerts. But what Whitfield didn't understand was that George had already found his legacy, and it was standing in a pasture not 50 yards away, trembling in the storm, but carrying forward an unbroken line of heritage that no building could ever replace. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Whitfield," George said carefully, "but I'm curious about something. How did you know to look for water rights on this property? These geological surveys you're referring to, they're not public information." For the first time since the conversation began, Whitfield looked genuinely uncomfortable. He glanced at his associates, both of whom suddenly found the rain-streaked windows fascinating to study. "Well, we do extensive research on all our potential acquisitions," Whitfield said evasively. "Due diligence is essential in our business." But Raymond stepped forward, his weathered face grim with understanding. "You've been talking to Clara Martinez," he said. "She showed you the papers, didn't she?" The silence that followed was answer enough. George felt his anger building like the storm outside, a slow burn that threatened to explode into something much more dangerous. "What papers?" George asked quietly. Raymond looked at him with an expression of deep regret. "Your father did more than just raise horses, George. He was part of a regional water conservation study back in the 70s, documented every spring, every well, every underground source on properties throughout this area. Clara's uncle was one of the other participants, and when he died, all his research passed to her." The implications hit George like a physical blow. His father hadn't just been a rancher and a horseman. He had been an environmental steward, working to protect and preserve one of Texas's most precious resources. And now that research was being used to exploit the very land he had tried to protect. Outside, the storm reached its peak intensity, with lightning illuminating the landscape in stark, dramatic flashes and thunder rolling across the hills like artillery fire. But inside the farmhouse, the real storm was just beginning to build, as George Strait realized that saving his childhood home would require more than nostalgia and good intentions. It would require him to uncover secrets that his father had kept hidden for decades, secrets that could either provide the key to preserving Thunder's heritage or lead to the destruction of everything John Byron Strait had worked to protect. And as the rain pounded against the shuttered windows, George knew that his quiet homecoming had just become a battle for the soul of rural Texas itself. The next revelation would come from an unexpected source, hidden in plain sight for over 40 years, waiting for the right storm to wash away the layers of time and expose the truth that would change everything. The storm raged for 3 hours, trapping George and the developers in an uncomfortable standoff that grew more tense with each flash of lightning. When the rain finally began to subside and the thunder moved off toward the east, Whitfield and his associates wasted no time in making their excuses and departing, their expensive sedans splashing through newly formed puddles as they headed back toward town. George stood on the porch watching their taillights disappear, feeling the weight of everything he had learned settling into his consciousness like sediment after a flood. The clean smell of rain-washed air should have been refreshing, but instead it carried an undertone of urgency that made his chest tight with anxiety. "We need to check on Thunder," Raymond said quietly, and George nodded, grateful for the excuse to move and think rather than stand still and worry. They found the horse pacing restlessly in his shelter, still agitated despite the passing of the storm. But as they approached, George realized that Thunder's distress wasn't entirely weather-related. The animal kept looking toward a section of the pasture where the heavy rain had carved a new gully through the soft earth, exposing something that hadn't seen daylight in decades. "What is that?" George asked, pointing toward a metallic glint that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Raymond squinted in the direction George was indicating, then his weathered face went pale. "I think we better take a closer look," he said grimly. They walked through the rain-soaked grass to the spot where runoff had carved its temporary channel, and what they found there made George's breath catch in his throat. Partially exposed by the storm's erosion was a metal box, its surface green with age, but still intact after years buried in the Texas earth. "Your father buried this," Raymond said with certainty. "I remember him working out here alone sometimes, always at dusk when the light was fading. Never said what he was doing, but I had my suspicions." George knelt beside the exposed box, his hands trembling as he cleared away the remaining soil. The container was about the size of a briefcase, made of heavy-gauge steel that had resisted the passage of time. There was no lock, just a simple latch mechanism that opened with a metallic click that seemed to echo across the quiet pasture. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected them from moisture and decay, were documents that would have made any Texas historian weep with joy. Land surveys dating back to the 1800s, mineral rights certificates, water usage agreements, and correspondence with state officials that painted a picture of John Byron Strait as a man far more connected and influential than his son had ever imagined. But it was the letter on top, written in his father's careful handwriting and addressed simply to George, that made the country music legend's hands shake as he unfolded the yellowed pages. "My dear son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have come home at last, and the storm that revealed this hiding place was meant to wash away more than just dirt and debris. There are things about this land, about our family, and about the responsibilities we carry that I never had the courage to tell you while I was alive." George looked up at Raymond, who was watching him with an expression of deep sympathy and understanding. "You knew about this letter?" "I suspected," Raymond replied. "Your father was a man of secrets, but they were good secrets, the kind that protect rather than deceive. He loved you too much to burden you with certain truths until you were ready to carry them." George continued reading, his father's words painting a picture of environmental stewardship and political maneuvering that spanned decades. John Byron Strait hadn't just been documenting water sources for scientific purposes, he had been part of a covert effort to prevent large corporations from exploiting Texas's underground aquifers for profit. "The water beneath our land is part of the Edwards Aquifer system," his father's letter continued. "What flows under our pastures eventually reaches San Antonio, Austin, and dozens of smaller communities. For 30 years, I worked with other ranchers and conservationists to keep detailed records of this resource, not to exploit it, but to protect it from those who would." The implications were staggering. George's father had been part of an underground network of environmental activists disguised as simple ranchers, using their properties as monitoring stations and safe havens for research that could have been dangerous in the wrong hands. The water rights that Whitfield was so eager to acquire weren't just valuable, they were critical to the survival of Central Texas. "There's more," Raymond said softly. "Keep reading." George turned to the second page of his father's letter, where the revelations became even more personal and shocking. I know you have wondered why I never pushed you to stay on the ranch, why I seemed almost eager to see you leave for Nashville. The truth is, I knew that your music would take you far from home, but I also knew that someday the fight for this land would require someone with influence and resources that a simple rancher could never command. I raised you to be a cowboy, George, but I also raised you to be a leader. The words hit George like a physical blow. His father hadn't just supported his musical career, he had orchestrated it as part of a long-term strategy to protect the family land and the precious resources it contained. Every platinum record, every sold-out concert, every dollar George had earned had been building toward this moment when he would have the power to stand against forces that would destroy what his father had spent his life protecting. "Look at the other documents," Raymond urged gently. George set the letter aside and began examining the papers beneath it, each one adding another layer to a story that was far more complex than he had ever imagined. There were contracts with environmental organizations, agreements with neighboring ranchers, and most surprisingly, legal documents that established a trust fund designed to purchase and protect threatened properties throughout South Texas. The trust had been funded through careful investment of profits from the family's legitimate ranching operations, but also through a more surprising source. George found receipts showing that his father had been systematically purchasing and reselling mineral rights throughout the region, not to exploit them, but to ensure they remained in the hands of people who would use them responsibly. "Your father was a wealthy man," Raymond revealed. "Not rich by your standards, maybe, but he had resources that nobody knew about. He spent 40 years building a war chest for a battle he knew would come someday." As George continued reading, he discovered that the battle had already begun long before Whitfield and his associates had appeared on the scene. Consolidated Development Corporation was just the latest in a series of companies that had tried to acquire key properties in the Edwards Aquifer region, each time meeting mysterious resistance from local landowners who seemed to have unlimited legal resources and political connections. The network your father built included judges, legislators, environmental lawyers, and about 50 ranchers scattered across 3 counties, Raymond explained. They've been fighting this same fight for decades, keeping the water safe and the land protected. But they're getting old, George. Your father was one of the last of the original group, and when he died, they lost their most important strategist. George looked up from the documents, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what he had discovered. His entire life story suddenly looked different when viewed through this lens. His success in Nashville hadn't been just about talent and determination. It had been about preparation for a role he never knew he was supposed to play. "But why didn't he tell me?" George asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why all the secrecy?" "Because he wanted you to choose this fight freely," Raymond answered. "He knew that if you came back to defend the land because you felt obligated, you might not have the passion necessary to see it through. But if you came back because you loved this place and understood what it meant, then you would fight with everything you had." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation, and George looked toward the road to see not 1, but 3 cars heading up the drive. The lead vehicle was Clara Martinez's small sedan, followed by Whitfield's black luxury car and a third vehicle that George didn't recognize. "This can't be good," Raymond muttered, helping George quickly repack the documents into their protective container. Clara Martinez was the first to reach them, a small woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and worry lines that spoke of years spent fighting battles she couldn't win alone. She looked at George with a mixture of recognition and desperate hope. "Mr. Strait," she said breathlessly, "I'm Clara Martinez. I own this property, or at least I do until tomorrow afternoon. Mr. Whitfield has been calling me all day, saying you might be interested in some kind of partnership deal, but I needed to talk to you first before I sign anything." Behind her, Whitfield was approaching with his 2 associates and a third man George didn't recognize. someone whose expensive suit and calculating expression marked him as another corporate player in this high-stakes game. "Mr. Strait," Whitfield called out with false joviality, "I'd like you to meet James Harrison, Senior Vice President of Aqua Texas Corporation. We've been discussing some exciting possibilities for a three-way partnership that could benefit everyone involved." George felt his anger building like steam pressure in an old locomotive. These men were circling like vultures around a woman who was being forced to choose between her family's future and her environmental responsibilities, using his presence as leverage to force a decision that would serve their interests rather than the land's protection. But now George had ammunition he hadn't possessed that morning. He had his father's documents, his father's network, and most importantly, his father's blessing to fight this battle with every resource at his disposal. "Gentlemen," George said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years in the spotlight and the weight of generations of Texas heritage, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's really at stake here. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Thunder and the land that had shaped George Strait into the man he had become, but the future of water resources for millions of Texans who had no idea that their survival depended on the outcome of a confrontation between a country music legend and corporate interests that valued profit over preservation. The final battle for John Byron Strait's legacy was about to begin. The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Pearsall for decades to come. George Strait, the king of country, standing in a rain-soaked pasture with a metal box full of secrets at his feet, facing down corporate executives who had underestimated both his intelligence and his determination to honor his father's legacy. "Mr. Harrison," George said, acknowledging the Aqua Texas executive with a nod that was polite but far from warm. "I assume you're here because Mr. Whitfield has told you about the water rights associated with this property." "Ah." Harrison's smile was smooth and practiced, the kind of expression that had probably closed 1,000 deals in air-conditioned conference rooms. "Mr. Strait, it's an honor to meet you. And yes, we're very interested in the aquifer access that this property provides. We believe there's an opportunity here for a partnership that could be incredibly lucrative for everyone involved." "Lucrative," George repeated, tasting the word like something unpleasant. "And what happens to the water once you've made your profit from it?" "Well, water is a commodity like any other," Harrison replied, with the confidence of someone who had never wondered where his next drink would come from. "Market forces ensure efficient distribution to where it's needed most." George looked at Clara Martinez, who was standing slightly apart from the corporate executives with an expression of barely contained desperation. This woman was being asked to choose between her children's future and the environmental heritage of Central Texas, and she didn't even fully understand what was at stake. "Mrs. Martinez," George said gently, "before you make any decisions, I think you should know what your uncle really left you." He knelt beside the metal box and removed several of the documents his father had hidden, including water usage studies that showed the critical importance of the aquifer system that lay beneath their feet. As he explained the research in terms that Clara could understand, George watched her expression change from confusion to understanding, to a kind of fierce determination that reminded him of his own mother. "You mean this land doesn't just affect our community?" Clara said slowly. "The water here eventually reaches San Antonio and Austin and New Braunfels and dozens of smaller towns," George confirmed. "Your uncle and my father spent 30 years documenting how everything is connected. What happens to this aquifer affects the drinking water for over 2 million people." Harrison stepped forward aggressively, his polished veneer beginning to crack. "Now wait just a minute. You can't possibly understand the complex economic factors involved in water resource management. This is a business decision, not an environmental activism meeting." "You're right," George said, standing to face the corporate executive directly. "I don't understand your complex economic factors, but I understand something you don't. He gestured toward Thunder, who had approached the fence and was watching the confrontation with intelligent eyes that seemed to reflect an understanding that went beyond animal instinct. "I understand legacy," George continued. "I understand that some things are more valuable than money, and that the choices we make today determine what kind of world we leave for our children and grandchildren." Whitfield, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, finally found his voice. "Mr. Strait, with all due respect, you're letting emotion cloud your business judgment. The development we're proposing would bring hundreds of jobs to this area, millions in tax revenue, and economic growth that this community desperately needs." "At what cost?" George asked. "You're talking about draining an aquifer that took thousands of years to fill, so you can build luxury condominiums for people who will never understand what this land really means." The argument might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of yet another vehicle. This one, a battered pickup truck that looked like it had seen more honest work than all the corporate sedans combined. The man who emerged from the truck was tall and lean, with silver hair beneath a well-worn cowboy hat, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent under the Texas sun. "Sorry I'm late," the newcomer said, walking directly to George with an extended hand. "Judge William McAllister retired. Your father asked me to keep an eye on things, and Raymond called to say you might need some legal assistance." George shook the judge's hand, feeling the same callous strength he had noticed in Raymond's grip. These were men who understood work and responsibility, concepts that seemed foreign to the corporate executives who were suddenly looking much less confident. "Judge McAllister," George said, "I'm beginning to understand that my father had more friends than I realized. Your daddy was a good man who spent his life protecting things that needed protecting," McAllister replied. "He told me that someday you'd need to know the truth about the network he built, and today seems like that day." What Judge McAllister revealed over the next hour transformed George's understanding of his father's legacy from remarkable to extraordinary. The water rights documentation was just the beginning. John Byron Strait had spent 40 years building legal protections for the Edwards Aquifer system, working with environmental lawyers, conservation organizations, and sympathetic politicians to create a web of regulations and restrictions that made large-scale water exploitation nearly impossible. "The trust your father established controls water rights to over 50,000 acres spread across 3 counties, McAllister explained, producing a leather portfolio that contained decades of legal work. "Every time a corporation like Aqua Texas tries to move into the region, they run into legal obstacles that make their projects economically unfeasible." Harrison's face had gone pale as he began to understand the scope of what he was facing. "You're talking about some kind of conspiracy to manipulate water markets," he accused. "We're talking about conservation," McAllister corrected firmly. "Everything we've done has been completely legal, properly documented and filed with the appropriate state agencies. We're protecting a natural resource that belongs to all Texans, not just the ones who can afford to buy it." Clara Martinez stepped forward, her earlier uncertainty replaced by resolute determination. "Mr. Whitfield, Mr. Harrison, I've heard enough. I'm withdrawing my property from sale. This land will remain in my family, and it will be protected according to my uncle's wishes." "Now wait just a minute," Whitfield sputtered. "We have contracts, deposits, commitments to our investors. You can't just walk away from a signed agreement." Judge McAllister smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades anticipating this exact moment. "Actually, she can. The environmental impact studies required for your development project were never properly completed. Without those studies, your contracts are null and void under Texas state law." The legal maneuvering that followed was swift and decisive. George learned that his father's network had been planning for this confrontation for years, putting legal safeguards in place that would protect not just the Martinez property, but dozens of other critical locations throughout the aquifer system. Whitfield and Harrison found themselves facing litigation that would tie up their projects for years, if not permanently. But for George, the real victory came when Clara Martinez approached him privately after the corporate executives had departed in frustration and defeat. "Mr. Strait," she said quietly, "I want to do more than just protect this land. I want to honor what your father and my uncle were trying to accomplish. Would you be interested in helping me turn this place into something that could educate people about water conservation and environmental stewardship?" The idea took root in George's imagination, like wildflowers after a spring rain. Not a museum or a sterile educational facility, but a working ranch that demonstrated sustainable practices while preserving the heritage and traditions that had shaped generations of Texas cowboys. Over the following months, George threw himself into the project with the same passion he had once brought to his music career. He purchased neighboring properties that came up for sale, expanded the horse breeding program with Thunder as the foundation stallion, and established partnerships with universities and conservation organizations that brought researchers and students to learn from the land his father had protected. The grand opening of the Strait Heritage Ranch took place on a crisp October morning, with Thunder carrying George across the same pastures where he had once ridden Whisper. Hundreds of people attended, including many of his father's old allies in the conservation network, environmental activists, local families, and even some of George's fellow country music stars who understood the importance of preserving authentic Texas heritage. But the moment that meant the most to George came when he stood before the crowd and pulled out his guitar, preparing to debut a song he had written using words from his father's journal. The melody was simple and heartfelt, the kind of tune that would stick in people's minds long after the last note faded away. "This song is called Water Runs Deep," George announced. "It's about the connections that bind us to the land, to each other, and to the future we're all responsible for creating." As he sang, George watched Thunder grazing peacefully in the pasture behind him, surrounded by mares and foals that represented the continuation of a bloodline that stretched back to Whisper and beyond. The horse looked up occasionally as if listening to the music, and George could swear he saw recognition and approval in those intelligent dark eyes. The ranch became everything George had hoped it would be, and more. Children from urban areas came to learn about ranch life and water conservation. University researchers studied sustainable grazing practices and aquifer protection. Young cowboys learned traditional skills while also understanding the environmental responsibilities that came with working the land. Raymond stayed on as ranch manager, his decades of experience invaluable in running the day-to-day operations. Judge McAllister became chairman of the ranch's educational foundation, using his legal expertise to expand the conservation network his father had started. And Clara Martinez, with the financial pressure removed from her life, was able to complete her veterinary studies and establish a practice that served the ranch and the surrounding community. 5 years after that stormy day, when George had first returned to his childhood home, he stood once again in the same pasture where Thunder had first approached the fence to greet him. But now the pasture was full of horses, the buildings had been restored to their original beauty, and the land pulsed with the kind of life and purpose that his father had always envisioned. Thunder, now 13 years old, had sired dozens of foals, each one carrying forward the bloodline that connected George to his past, while pointing toward a future where tradition and conservation could coexist. The horse approached George as he always did, pressing his muzzle against his shoulder with an affection that had only deepened over the years. "We did it, boy," George whispered, running his hand along Thunder's neck. "We saved what needed saving and built what needed building." Dad would be proud. As the sun set over the Texas hill country, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had inspired George's love of this land as a child, he felt a peace that all his musical success had never been able to provide. He had found his way home, not just to a place, but to a purpose that would outlast any song he had ever written. The Strait Heritage Ranch stood as proof that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not for profit or fame, but for the preservation of something authentic and irreplaceable. And in the bloodline of horses that carried Whisper's legacy forward into the future, George had found the greatest gift his father could have given him: the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The King of Country had returned to his true kingdom, and it was more beautiful and meaningful than any stage he had ever commanded. In saving Thunder, he had saved himself, and in preserving the land, he had discovered that the most powerful legacy isn't measured in records sold or awards won, but in the connections we maintain with the people and places that shape us into who we're meant to become.